Welcome to the Bayesian Conspiracy. I'm Eneasz Brodsky.
I'm Steven Zuber, and today we have a guest.
I am Tracing Woodgrains.
Trace. We can call you Trace for short, right?
That's absolutely. Many people do.
Welcome to the podcast. We are fans of you. At least I am. Steven, have you heard of Trace before?
Of course.
Okay, good. We're both fans of you then, because anyone who's heard of you is a fan of you.
Do we want to zoom out a little bit and give Trace a chance to introduce himself and tell us who he is?
Oh, Jesus, yeah.
Yeah.
Some people might not know who Trace is, because they live in some weird other world.
Trace, who are you?
I go by Tracing Woodgrains or Trace online. I currently work for Blocked and Reported as the researcher, producer, what have you. Other than that, I'm currently in law school. Those are kind of the mundane life facts about me. Beyond that, I have recently come into some small degree of notoriety on Twitter for inserting myself into various dramas or providing my takes on various culture war issues, so forth. I tend to talk a lot about things like excellence in education, bringing forward a more effective centrist movement, and things in that vein.
Awesome. And you were on some recent-ish episode of Blocked and Reported talking about that FAA air traffic control exam thing, right?
Yeah, a couple months ago. So I had a big viral thread on Twitter and then a couple of follow-ups and a couple of interviews about it, including on BarPod, talking about back in 2014, this big scandal in the FAA where people replaced any sort of merit-based test with this absurd biographical questionnaire that was very much demonstrably rigged in ways that make you sound like a conspiracy theorist as soon as you start ranting about it.
That's why I liked it so much, is it sounds like exactly like the kind of ravings of some online nut job until it's like, oh, look, no, here's all the paperwork. I thought it was delightful. And my job is FAA adjacent, not anything to do with air traffic control exactly, but it was close enough that I considered sharing it with the work channel, but I was like, it's a small startup. I don't know. I don't want to be perceived as throwing shade towards, the FAA, but I liked it enough that I was titillated by it. So if anyone hasn't found that, I recommend finding that too.
Oh, thank you.
So this all came out in 2014, right?
Yes.
Why did it take this long for it to become public?
So to be clear, it didn't take this long for it to become public. It was public enough at the time that a congressional resolution reversed the test at some point. What did take so long, it became public in bits and pieces, in spurts here and there, a bunch of FOIA requests, a bunch of people trying to dig and pull out the story and so forth. And so what would happen is they would go to one reporter about it and he would tell a part of the story and they'd share, here are these crazy things. And so this reporter at Fox Business did a big thing with it. And then a while later, Tucker Carlson would pick it up and he'd say, yeah, there's this thing going on. And then everyone would kind of forget about it. And then it sort of just bounced around the whole right-wing news ghetto in a few very obscure places with not many people really talking about it. But so basically people felt like it was this known story, this known quantity that had already been covered, but it had never really gotten much attention. It had never really gotten much notoriety. And the whole time there's this class action lawsuit that was going on and revealing more and more, and these FOIA requests that were pulling out more and more, which meant that every bit of reporting on it had just been sort of recycling the same 2 or 3 bits of information without ever looking at, so where's everything going now and what's actually happening with it and what's the full picture that we now have at this point. That just never really came out because nobody bothered to do it until I made a really petty bet.
Wait, a petty bet?
I think the details are in the episode.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a quick overview of that is I was arguing about something tangentially related and saying, look, here's this crazy thing that happened. Some guy wanted a little more evidence and he was like, none of these things seem to have any pictures of the test, anything like that. Are we sure this test exists? And I was like, yes, we're sure this test existed. But he was really persistent. He was like, surely all these outlets would have followed up on it better if, there was actually meat there. And I said basically, look, they have ADHD. There's no way they would. And I bet I could do a better job in a few hours than they've been doing with it. And so then I did.
So the "someone is wrong on the internet" meme actually produced huge results in the real world.
That is how I do almost all of my work.
Awesome. Real quickly, FOIA is short for Freedom of Information Act, right?
Yes.
Okay. Was this the thing, the big thing that made you go big viral, or was there big things before as well.
Yeah, it's been interesting. It feels like things have sort of been simmering for a while, and right around the start of this year, there were three things right in a row that really dramatically raised my profile. So the first one was a little more obscure. It didn't go like viral among the public, but I looked at the results of this effective altruist investigation into the organization Nonlinear, and talked about, hey, here are the flaws in this investigation. Here are the things that went wrong. Did an after action review of that. That got me a lot of notoriety among that very specific crowd. From there, one person who was interested in that and appreciated that said, hey, could I hire you to look into this other thing? And he had me look at Brian Johnson, the guy who wants to live forever, the like centimillionaire who injects his son's blood and is always going on about, health, all that. Anyway, he had an ugly lawsuit between him and his ex-fiancée, who he dumped while she was just finishing chemotherapy for stage 3 breast cancer. He was portraying himself as a victim of false accusations. This guy was really convinced that that was not an accurate portrayal of things, had me look into it. I looked in. I realized that he had been a complete scumbag in this and was basically using having gotten the lawsuit dismissed as therefore everything was totally fine and my behavior was fine. And I basically said, look, here's the actual lawsuit. Here's what actually happened. Very similar thing to the FAA thing. Here are the publicly available papers, digging in and saying, this is what happened. And that was the first thing that went really, really viral for me. Then a few weeks after that, the FAA thing came in. And between the two of those, and then a couple things that happened around the same time, my public profile jumped 10 times in the space of a month.
Wow. Impressive. So you mentioned the nonlinear thing, which is, for me, was even bigger than the Brian Johnson thing, specifically because we are in the rat circles. It's what the podcast is all about. I recently saw you had, you quoted or posted a screenshot of your first comment on Less Wrong, which I think was from the early 2010s. I don't recall exactly now. But then also you recently said that you consider yourself more like rat adjacent than actual rationalist. What is the difference between those two for you? Like, if you've been commenting on Less Wrong for a decade plus, how does that translate into rat adjacent?
I haven't been commenting on Less Wrong for a decade plus. That was from the Slate Star Codex subreddit. So the route that I came into this whole sphere was when I was a teenager. I would read rationalist sphere stuff, but not really realize what it was. And I didn't like how anti-religion they were. And so after a while, I just kind of bounced off it and went my separate way. A while later, my sister recommended this fun Harry Potter fanfic to me, and I was like, yeah, sure, Methods of Rationality, that sounds fun, I'll give it a read. And I didn't really connect it to that whole Less Wrong stuff that I had read some a while back. And then, similar time to that, someone on like some LDS subreddit, some weird far-right seeming guy, started linking articles from the site that I was like, okay, this has got to be some weird, suspicious, like, nonsense blog. It was, what sort of name is this? Slate Star Codex? And I start digging through, and I'm like, hold on. Actually, this blog is really, really good. And I started, so I sort of came in through the back door there, was always much more of a fan of Slate Star Codex specifically than big R rationalist. And so I've appreciated the rationalist community, and I've, obviously interacted with it pretty closely for a while, but I've always been on the peripheries of the rationalist community proper. My actual first comment on Less Wrong, to my recollection, had to do with the nonlinear stuff. Or I think I had very sparse comments before that, but yeah.
Okay. It's weird because Slate Star Codex, like, Scott Alexander is the rightful caliph, right? So as rad as you can get, but he's got such a wide readership that, yeah, there's a lot of people not rationalists that are also involved in that.
I can dig it.
It feels weird that you read Methods of Rationality and you're into Slate Star Codex, but I guess that's a lot of people nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, and here's the thing. Like, I share the personality profile and I share the background of rationalists. Like, they are in a lot of ways my people, as it were, just like effective altruists are in a lot of ways my people. But I have all these niggling small differences and small and not so small differences. And I come from an authentically different enough set of cultural memes and set of assumptions that, you won't really hear me talking about Bayesian priors or things like that. You won't hear me doing the hard math on everything in that way, such that I am familiar to rationalists when they read me, but I am in not quite the same memeplex.
I mean, I think nowadays that we have rationalist hippies and rationalist Catholics and all, we can probably throw the umbrella a little wider, but obviously don't want to claim people who would rather not claim that.
I still don't know what rationalist is. I've been doing this podcast for like 8 years, so I'm happy with your associations.
I think the original definition was someone who disagrees with Eliezer Yudkowsky.
Yeah, well, I do that plenty of times, but
So adjacent for you just means like you don't feel close enough to the community to really feel like you're part of it?
it means that I want to highlight that my thought process and the memeplex that I accept and the framework that I accept is different in enough key ways from the rationalist community that it is more misleading to consider me part of the rationalist community proper than it is to consider me my own thing, appreciating the rationalist community, interacting with the rationalist community, but maintaining a degree of separation.
Oh, so what is the one or two biggest differences?
It's interesting because everything you can criticize about rationalism, someone in rationalism has criticized it. But the big thing that I would highlight is I have always been much more interested in the question of rationalism to what end than rationalism as an end in itself. That is, I am much more interested in finding a community that aligns with me on a very specific set of positive values, positive ideals, that then, yes, it includes rationalism as one part in the toolkit to that end, but is not defined by rationalism as an end in itself. What I perceive rationalists and effective altruists in particular doing is really leaning into utilitarianism and really leaning into what I'd call adjacency blind utilitarianism, where they don't really recognize a sense of duty to the near in the same way that I necessarily would. And I'm not a utilitarian. I'm a virtue ethicist, and I don't really accept the moral memeplex of them precisely. But the differences that I have are important for me to maintain with it. The differences that I have are fundamental differences in terms of that memeplex, such that, yes, I think rationalism is a useful tool towards the ends that I want to pursue, but the ends that I want to pursue are emphatically values-driven ones and are subtly but importantly different to the ones that rationalists pursue, the rationalist community proper pursues.
I like it. I'm not going to split hairs or try and make it put on the uniform or anything. We've got our share of virtue ethicists, but
oh yeah, no, and I understand it.
Yeah,
like I'm friendly. I go to meetups. I would go to if I was invited to some of the rationality meetups and everything. Of course, I'd go. I like it. Oh, another thing is the whole AI safety stuff. So maybe if rationalism hadn't leaned really hard into AI safety, I would have stayed in that memeplex or been drawn closer to that memeplex. Honestly, I understand the argument. I understand why people care about it. I understand why people think about it so much. I cannot make myself focus on it to the same degree. So it's another example of one of those topics that the rationalist community really fixates on. It was essentially Eliezer Yudkowsky's purpose at some point in building the community was to build this focus towards it. And, I recognize that. I appreciate that. I'm glad a group is doing that. That is not what I want my group specifically to be focused on.
I can dig it. The AI thing, I don't have anything approaching a rejoinder for, so...
I feel the same way about animal safety, or not animal safety, but animal welfare.
Right. And so exactly. It's a lot of things like this where I really like the people and I really respect them and I really respect their reasoning for being drawn to these things. But I'm not going to pretend that that's the memeplex that I align fully with and the motivations that animate me.
Yeah. Over the past half decade, I've grown very much closer to the actually near stuff is really important, and we have been neglecting that point of view. So that is interesting to hear.
Nice. Well, I also heard you say if you'd be willing to come to any meetups or anything. If you're ever in the Denver area, hit us up. We do a monthly meetup and we'd grab dinner or something.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm not anywhere near there these days now that I'm out in Philly, but I will keep it in mind if I happen to be.
A lot of people change planes here,
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love Denver. Been there a couple times. Beautiful city. Mountain West is the place, but...
Do you go to the solstice celebrations?
I haven't. And this is another thing that makes me more adjacent than rationalist is that I really haven't... I've gone to Slate Star Codex meetups. I haven't gone to a lot of the rationalist meetups.
You know what? I want to pick your brain about that later. We're getting a little off topic. I guess real quick, you said that you want rationality to be in the service of certain ideals and values that you have, but you didn't say what those ideals and values are. What are those ideals and values?
Absolutely. I would say that the ideals and values that I focus on are sort of the framework that I view life through is the vision of life as a struggle against entropy, lifelessness, decay, and death towards life, creativity, growth, and the impossible pursuit of perfection. A struggle that I recognize is, on an individual and perhaps on a species-wide scale, a doomed struggle, but a struggle that is worth pursuing. And that's really what animates me.
Why doomed?
Well, this goes back to my religious background. Growing up Mormon, I would always say there are all these impossible contradictions and all these things that we necessarily will face down. We are all going to die. We all make horrible mistakes, so forth. But Christ died for us. We can be saved and we can go on to eternal life somewhere else. Now that I have stepped outside that framework, what I am left is the Christian line, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And if we don't, and so far nobody has actually escaped death, and so far as a species we have not figured out a way to escape entropy, and as a universe we have not figured out any of these things, that so far as any of us can tell, and so far as anyone who has ever lived has experienced, every individual struggle for these things is doomed, and yet we have built something beautiful along the way. And perhaps we can accomplish the impossible. One hopes we can accomplish the impossible, but we don't know yet.
Man, that's beautifully put.
Yeah. So not necessarily doomed, though.
Not necessarily. We're the hopeful damned. We we recognize the impossibility and the futility of our pursuit in one sense, but we are determined that the pursuit itself is beautiful and that the end, if we can attain it, will be worth attaining.
Holy shit, dude. You could be like a preacher.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of my big things right now is the idea that we do need a healthy modern religious movement, and I think that it needs to be compatible with secular ideals and compatible with truth, but it does need to be unified around positive values. And so it's not a coincidence. I think that it is important to think in those terms.
Well, that is literally why I brought you on here, because I've been thinking a lot about some sort of rationalist religion lately, and you have a Twitter thread about the current major religion that is sweeping the nation. You have this Twitter thread that starts with social justice progressivism is the first time most people, including most Christians, have encountered a truly vital religion. Social justice progressivism, why did you choose that term as opposed to wokeism or intersectionality or something else?
Terminology games give me a headache every time. Mm-hmm. And obviously wokeism has mostly been adopted by the movement's enemies. Intersectionality covers only part of it. As far as I was able to determine, social justice progressivism was the term that would most cohesively capture the essence of it without raising the hackles of the people within it.
I have found that every single time there is some sort of identifier, it tends to raise their hackles eventually. Like, woke originally came from them, right? I am betting that if this catches on within 6 months, they will hate the term social justice progressivism as well. You think you're safe in that for now?
Yeah, I think that it is a much harder term for them to dislike because they like social justice, they like progressivism, they like each of those words individually, and they very strongly like each of those words individually. Pulling them all together, I think, is very close to a positive vision of how they would identify themselves. And so I understand the concerns about a euphemism treadmill, but I don't really see that happening.
And it does have the maximum amount of syllables and difficulty to say quickly, so... Yeah. Checks that box.
Absolutely.
I pulled out a bunch of notes on how you described a vital religion. Do you want to tell us what a vital religion is?
Absolutely. And one thing I want to emphasize for people hearing this, social justice progressivism is a religion, is not at all a new take. It's not something that's original to me. It's something that has been, a lot of people would argue, beaten to death. John McWhorter has talked a lot about it. Helen Lewis has talked about it. A bunch of people have dived into it. But I think people are talking about it because it's true. And the thing that draws me to it is I feel like a lot of people talking about it are intuitively a little bit anti-theist. Intuitively, they don't really like religion. And so when they're trying to compare it to religion, they're saying, and this is bad, and this is bad, and this is bad. I am much more friendly in a lot of ways towards the concept of religion in the abstract. And so when I'm calling it a religion, I want to emphasize that I'm not calling it a religion as a way of dismissing it, but as a way of understanding it.
I just want to say this is exactly the reason why I loved your thread and I wanted to have you on specifically. Like, I read McWhorter when he first talked about it, and like it was all true, but it was also, you couldn't dig into it. It didn't feel like there was anything there to say aside from like, yep, religious people kind of suck, right? And your love of the topic, your innate like feeling of warmth towards religion really makes it all feel much more alive and important and something to be engaged with. And I think you are like probably the best person that I know of anyway to talk about this and to advance this idea.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, that means a lot.
And I think it has everything to do with your background. So yeah,
It's a nicely it's going to be refreshing, but that'd make Eneash's take sound old and stale, but it's not. No. Eneash was Jehovah's Witness, or was rather raised Jehovah's Witness, and so you've still got the interest in it, but more of like this deep seated, I don't know, disdain / betrayal from it, rather than kind of being able to hold on to any sort of reverence for the good parts of an organized religion. Although that might be
Right.
changing the last couple of years for you.
I mean, I've got a really strong Christian fetish. I love all the stuff, but also the intense sense of betrayal it's less now. The sting has gone away over the decades, but there's still, a burr in there.
And I'd add with that, for people who don't know a lot about my background, that growing up Mormon, I think the thing that prevented me from feeling quite the same deep sense of betrayal as many is that the whole process, even while I was a very serious believer, I was always making it very clear to people, I don't know that this is true. I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure out where I stand on everything. And it took me 22 years to figure out where I stood on everything, but I experienced it as, yes, there were a few weeks of very deep hurt and very deep betrayal, but I experienced it as a gradual process of coming into my own and coming to accept my own beliefs more than a process of feeling a system wrenched away from me and thinking that I had been lying to myself this whole time.
Oh, wow. And they accepted you doing that?
Yeah, in a lot of ways they did.
Damn.
Yeah. And that's been another thing. Like, the Mormons in my life have always been extremely gracious to me, and that's made it very easy for me to maintain warm feelings towards them.
Yeah, that's awesome. And now they have like kind of an ally out in the atheist world, right?
Yeah, in a much greater sense than most ex-Mormons would be, absolutely. But yeah, so to return to the idea of what a vital religion is, the way I would define it is the unifying principle that stands at the core of someone's belief system, that tells them what to do and why to do it in all domains. So the things I will highlight in terms of Christianity, for example, is that separation of church and state is not the natural state of things. Christianity didn't come into the world, and Christianity didn't spread through the world saying, we want to just be our own thing, we want to just govern our own people and leave the state to its own. A little bit. You can say render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but by the time the Middle Ages hit, you had a religion that was very much unified with the state. You had very much this idea of a theocracy, and still fundamentally Christians want on some level a theocracy when Christ returns again, and they think this ideal system of governance looks like this very Christian system of governance. But over the years, in real life, that became untenable, and I think the sense of religion and state being inseparable and inevitable really died as early as Westphalia, as these state religions realized that they had been fighting a lot of bloody wars, and they could either coexist or they could all kill each other. And at some point, they have to give up this idea of ultimate supremacy in that domain. And so that's one way I describe Christianity as having gotten tamed there.
What is the Peace of Westphalia?
Sure. So the Peace of Westphalia, this is where I am going to show my own ignorance a little bit, is that I'm not a history expert. It's not like I know everything about the religious wars of the mid 1400 1800, that time. But what the Peace of Westphalia was, it's the peace treaties signed that ended the 30 Years' War, brought peace to Europe after a struggle between the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, all of these intense religious wars that were struggles between Protestants and Catholics, fundamentally. That's what it was the peace treaty that said Protestantism exists, Catholicism exists. Both of these religions are going to remain forces in this broad sphere that everyone in that area is aware of to one degree or another, even as we maintain a firm conviction that we are correct, we cannot defeat this other religion without destroying too much.
Okay. And all that, I guess, can be traced back to Martin Luther with his 95 Theses.
Yeah. One could theoretically trace it even further back, but yes, the 95 Theses are a key salient point. That as soon as Martin Luther, as legend has it, pounds those 95 Theses up on the door, that is the very serious threat to the vitality of Catholicism as this ultimate source of authority. And it set in motion the taming of Catholicism. Or you look at the separation of church and science. That's not a natural thing either. That's not the natural state of a religion. A religion is a claim to understand the truth, a claim to be the source of a lot of truth. And so you look at a lot of these early scientific advancements, and they were made within the Catholic Church and with the Catholic Church's approval. The Catholic Church was driving science forward in large part because they wanted to understand God's creation. They wanted to understand the way the world works. And eventually a tension entered in between areas of science and religion. And of course, modern Christians have reconciled those things in large part. Not all of them, but a lot of them have reconciled evolution, have reconciled old earth, so forth, have reconciled these things that were not intuitively aligned with their scripture. But it took a reconciling. It took running into a force that is different to your force and at least as powerful as your own force that you need to make compromises with. And so you look at the current state of Christianity in almost every denomination, and the people who are really uncompromising and really trying to maintain this vitality, this all-consuming nature of it, they're treated as fundamentalists and treated as people who are oddities more than anything, whereas most people have grown very accustomed to what I would call a certain tame sort of religion, where religion has its domain, politics has its domain, science has its domain, everyone can have their own religion and that's fine, we'll all get along and that's fine, it's acceptable, but this is what I believe. And that's a very tame way to have a religion.
You give quite a few examples of how it is the source of authority in the lives of people, their deep religious belief, and specifically this urgent need to spread the belief where only fools or evil people, you say, would resist conversion. It feels true. I remember the atheism wars and how strongly it felt that, like, obviously there is no God and it's important to help get that word out there. And I guess that must have been like what earlier Christians and religious people thought too. Like, this is just the way the world works, and it's important for people to know.
Absolutely. As a Mormon, I was always taught, Mormonism is very proudly a proselytizing religion. Mormonism is very focused on the whole world must know the truth, and it is our duty to bring it to them. But the way I would describe the day-to-day Mormon experience of that is as a sort of half-hearted, yeah, but we kind of know that everyone's going to not really be interested when we try to sell them on Mormonism. And we kind of know that we'll be a little bit intrusive if we try to be too pushy. And some questions might be kind of obnoxious to answer. And so there's a missionary spirit among Mormonism, but it's a little bit of what I describe as a damped missionary spirit or a frustrated missionary spirit, where many of them, and certainly I, felt like I could never quite internalize with conviction the idea that everyone should be Mormon and that I could persuade everyone to be Mormon because it was so clearly right. That was never quite something that I could convince myself of in a way sufficient to really spur the sort of passionate, vital evangelism that some achieve.
You have this great line. You say people would take Mormon claims, then evaluate them through the lens of secular liberalism and find them wanting. The faith struggles perpetually to define the frame, which I think it's basically the encapsulation of that, right? Like, a vital religion is the frame and everything is viewed in that light. And so since Mormonism was being interpreted through a different lens, it couldn't be the frame. It wasn't the vital religion.
Exactly. It's like to talk about Mormonism, I had to describe to people, no, and here's why I think Mormonism is compatible with science, and here's why I think Mormonism is compatible with liberalism, and here's how I have reconciled these history claims of Mormonism, and here's how I have reconciled these specific truth claims of Mormonism with the things that you and I both agree on, and here is how it fits into our shared frame, where it could never be, and here's how it defines the whole frame.
As opposed to secular liberalism, which does define the whole frame.
Yes, and as opposed to on point, progressive social justice, which is emphatic, which is vigorous in its certainty that its frame is the correct one. And I think what happened, and one way that I've tried to describe it recently, is that as Christianity faded in salience in America, for a long while, Christianity was the driving moral force behind progressive movements in America. So you had Christians on both sides of a lot of struggles in a lot of ways. So in the struggle against slavery, sure, some people were trying to hold to Christian principles to say this is why slavery is fine. Bible says people have servants and everything. We're just doing that. Versus the people who were really adamant that their religion, their religious impulses were a justification against slavery. Or you had people like William Jennings Bryan, who on the one hand was this famous reformer for workers' rights and everything, all this stuff, all these very things that would be very cozy with modern progressives, while at the same time being a really big proponent of prohibition and anti-evolution stuff. Because for him, all of these social justice and evangelical ideas were pretty much inseparable. For a long time, that was the animating force behind a lot of these people there. That really started to change in the late 20th century, and particularly as you get to the gay rights movement. I would pinpoint this as the time when religious participation is declining, where progressivism has really separated from religion in a lot of ways, and where suddenly you have this progressive movement that is extremely fundamentally a-religious and even anti-Christian in its sentiment, in the sense of Christianity being very adamant that this is how marriage has always been defined, and the progressives saying, this time you guys are very fundamentally the bigots here, and we are going to push this. And you had this generation, this couple of generations, where suddenly people raised in an increasingly secular world, in as much as they wanted to do any sort of like activism, any sort of make the world a better place, change the world, in as much as they wanted to unite around this common good cause, that common good cause became one that in no sense relied on Christianity, and in many senses was in tension with Christianity.
I remember being in this space when I was in my teens and 20s. I just felt like the motivation to do good, and this was the obviously good course. It feels almost weird because like all our predecessors had God is on our side or some supernatural, greater, universal purpose driving them. What was the driver here? Is there anything explicitly stated?
That's the really interesting thing about social justice progressivism. And in as much as I see a really strong argument against it as a religion, it's that I would describe it as a decentralized religion in a way where a lot of religions have really clear rallying points. You know, Mormonism, they say Joseph Smith restored the original Church of Jesus Christ. And you have this very clear prophet, this very clear breaking point, this very clear canon, so forth. Whereas social justice progressivism emerged out of this pastiche of academic theory, old school Marxism, toss in a dash of postmodernism, toss in the general consensus of academia, starting to filter down through the pop lens and filter down through places like Tumblr and the internet more broadly, where a bunch of young people are poking through all this theory and just accepting this general framework that had been built up in academia. So in terms of authority, I would say that academia is probably the authority that ultimately I would point to as the root of social justice progressivism. That as people started accepting science as an ultimate authority, alongside that they started leaning into trust the experts more thoroughly, trust the academics as the experts. And then you had a lot of disciplines within academia who went in their peculiar theoretical directions and spun up this or that idea that a lot of people who appreciated the general academic feel to things and appreciated the sense of, oh yeah, this is rigorous, true things that these people are seeking out, started treating that as the same way that they felt like science was a fundamental source of truth. They felt like these things were as firmly defined and as clearly accurate.
That was really cool for me, like illuminating connection, because the main, I don't know, disconnect I have between social justice, progressivism, and pick your religion is like the central authority. You know, for Catholics, it might be, it could be like Jesus or the Bible, or it could be the Pope or something, right? But they have like the person or the very small group they point to as saying, these are the ones we believe. And I think having identified that for the SJP religion helped just help clarify that for me.
Do you think this is why a lot of research that does not support SJP just can't get published anymore?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that ultimately you have different value systems coming into tension, and you have people who have decided, look, as soon as you decide with science that the goal of science is not solely truth seeking, but the goal of science is truth seeking to some other end, then that other end determines a great deal. And so as soon as people decide this part of science is immoral, this part of science is immoral, this part of science is immoral, and look, some of the things that they decided are immoral, one can make a very strong argument that those things are immoral. But as soon as you close off those avenues of investigation, then you're not doing science anymore. You are doing a sort of theology where you are understanding the world through this very specific moral lens and saying, how can we pursue this moral lens? And look, this isn't just social justice progressivism. Like, this was already a very much a thing with old school liberalism. That a lot of that already came in, but it just intensified as the social justice progressive movement took over.
This would kind of mean that the separation of church and state is almost non-existent now, considering the vast amount of public resources that go into fueling academia.
Yeah, so this was a funny thing recently. I was in my constitutional law class, and we were looking at this case, talking about whether Maine could deny funding to Christian schools if it had a voucher system. I'm butchering it a little bit, but that was the essence of it. And I can't bring myself to care a lot about cases like that because I experience the university I'm at as very much the equivalent of a Catholic school. Just with its own set of quirks. And that doesn't mean I hate it. That doesn't mean, like, I've had a great time there, and my professors have been very welcoming. I've made good friends. People have made it very clear that my perspective is welcome, and I have been very honest about my thoughts, and no one has, warded me off and said, how dare you? Like, it's not any sort of stereotype that people would think of. But, you go in day one and you have your seminar on microaggressions, and you go to any of these extra meetings, and you have these prison abolitionists coming in, and you have these people who lean in very much to this social justice framework, and you just don't really hear a lot of things outside that framework. And yeah, absolutely, it does feel very fundamentally religious to me in a way that makes it hard for me to care about establishment of Christianity. And as much as people are seeing that as a concern, it just seems so irrelevant to me right now.
Yeah. One of the lines that really struck me from your Twitter thread, which put into stark contrast just how much this has taken over and is the lens through which everything is seen, is that you said very few people make their cases for any sort of political argument without appealing to social justice, as even the Republicans, as the ever-present Republican refrain that the Democrats are the real racists reminds us. Like, the argument isn't that they are against God or any other thing. It's that we all know racism is the bad thing. Racism is what is blasphemy and sacrilege. And we're just arguing about who's the real racist, which concedes that the frame is the social progressive frame that everything else is judged by. It's like the Mormon faith being judged by how well it fits into the secular liberalism idea.
Yeah, absolutely. It is striking. I think this is something that you see dissident right figures really revolting against, is that they want to be the ones setting the frame. And so they go in all sorts of weird and ugly directions with that and say, okay, so if we want to step out of the social justice frame, then maybe Hitler wasn't a bad guy after all. And maybe the Confederates were not bad guys after all. And they just go in really inane, ugly directions with it. But the fundamental idea of they are aware that the frame is being set by people who do not share their values and do not share their ideals, that's something that the Republican Party as a whole didn't have for a while. And they were always, very much on the back foot. Even now, a lot of mainstream conservatives are very much on the back foot, saying we want to defend our values in the frame of this broader shared social justice framework that we all more or less accept.
Okay, so what's the difference here between just the regular social liberalism that we have and the new social justice progressivism, which seems to be much more virulent and is literally taking over things in a way that seems to be unprecedented?
I would say social liberalism is in some ways an inherently antiviral idea, because a lot of it's the libertarian-esque idea of do what you want. If someone feels strongly that they ought to pursue this, then who are you to tell them no? So liberalism is very much live and let live, everyone get along. I love liberalism, but I think the thing it has always lacked is this positive end to work towards. That it's very hard to identify this very specific positive end within liberalism. And I think that as a sidetrack, I think that the most productive movements are A, within liberalism, but B, adamant about pursuing specific positive ends that go beyond just the general liberal principle of we all want to get along, don't we? Social justice progressivism has more or less, not entirely, but more or less abandoned liberal principles in favor of much more, as you say, much more virulent framework, much more adamant framework, where it looks and broadly divides the world into the ideas of this is a privileged or oppressor group, this is an oppressed group. Our job is to fight on behalf of the oppressed against the oppressors. And a lot of this quote unquote liberalism stuff is just white moderates getting in the way of true justice. So their goals become much more emphatically not everyone will do what you want, but everyone will work together to rectify deep historical systemic injustices.
That's thought-provoking. I hadn't considered that generic liberalism didn't really have an end goal. To the extent that things like, I don't know, the anti-segregation and civil rights for, I guess, non-whites, and then later on for like gay marriage and stuff, was that, would you say, like, I don't know, an early segment or early faction of like the SJP, the social justice progressivism is too many syllables for me to not stumble over? Or was that, to me the goal, if there was one, of liberalism is kind of just like, not just my freedom to swing my fist ends where your face begins, but also like equal opportunity for everybody.
Right. It's like free speech, equal rights.
Yeah. But I guess those are kind of, you're right, maybe those are kind of bedrock tenets as opposed to like explicit goals once the foundation has been met.
Right. Free speech to say what? Equal rights towards what end? Equal opportunity towards what goals? I think the free speech battle really highlights the perplexity with regular liberalism. And I think the thing that drives a lot of people towards more viscerally satisfying ends is, you fight on behalf of free speech and you get a coalition together that wants to fight on behalf of free speech. And in the end, what positive end are they pursuing? Like, great, you have a lot of people arguing things out in the marketplace of ideas. That's fine. That's cool. What do you actually want to win in the marketplace of ideas? And liberals really shy away from saying, no, I definitely want this specific moral framework, this specific idea to win in the marketplace of ideas. If someone has a different religion than me, that's totally acceptable. That's totally reasonable. If someone has a different view of the good life, that's totally fine. And they often are, I would say, afraid to take their own side in a way that I think both progressives and reactionaries blanch against to an extent.
Why did that happen? Like, I remember when the ACLU was awesome and would even defend fucking Nazis because free speech, those civil liberties, those rights were like our religion, right? This is what we believed in. This was the goal we were fighting for, that anybody could say anything because that is what's important for a society. And I do think it's really important to have ideals and beliefs like that to motivate people, because without that motivation, like, what do you got? You got nothing, got no reason to do anything. What happened that motivation got abandoned or turned into this new elevate the groups that we feel are oppressed and crush the ones that we feel were oppressors. How did we lose that religious framing for this new one?
I think it's just, I don't want to say a quirk of history, because nothing is ever exactly a quirk of history. There are always pretty clearly defined reasons. If you want to look at a specific thing, again, I'll go back to the gay rights struggle and say this was really the turning point in many ways. But in particular, and this is where I think people like yourself who had some connection with the New Atheist movement really started to notice something, is for someone like me growing up Mormon, I always felt like I was living in this world dominated by a framework of people who were my enemies, fundamentally, who fundamentally misunderstood and hated my values and misrepresented me anytime they represented me. That's the world I always felt like I lived in. So I didn't, even as I was stepping away from that, I never noticed this major shift in progressive attitudes. A lot of New Atheists did. And I think the reason a lot of New Atheists did is that gay marriage itself was this extremely unifying battle for this whole coalition. It wasn't a unifying battle for the Christians who were against it. It wasn't at all. But it was extremely unifying. You know, you had years of first pushing against Bush and the Iraq War and everything that a lot of people could get behind. You had things of pushing against fundamentalists that a lot of people could get behind. And you had this grand unifying fight for gay marriage that seemed so good and so right and so powerful. And so a great deal of organization was built up to that end, and a great deal of energy was built up to that end. And then suddenly it ended. Suddenly in 2015 with Obergefell, all this latent energy is just sitting there, because suddenly all of this fighting that people have been doing and all this organizing that people have been doing and all this passion that people have been building accomplished its goal, and it didn't just dissipate. Suddenly, all of these New Atheists who had been able to, all these civil libertarians who had been able to get along with the more aggressive progressives and so forth, experienced themselves being pushed out of the coalition a little bit as this single grand unifying battle was won. All these organizations, if they didn't want to disband, needed to find another fight. And if civil libertarians weren't on board with whatever new fight, then suddenly they were out. And all these other oppressed groups, as it were, or all these groups that conceived of themselves as oppressed in one way or another, suddenly said, okay, now it's our turn. Now it's our fight. But none of those fights managed to be as cohesive or as unifying as gay marriage. But the framework had been advanced so far that suddenly coalition splintered, and many more activists were looking around for something to jump on.
Huh. And what did they jump on?
I mean, you see the trans movement in large part having supplanted it. You saw feminism for a while, this strain of, Jezebel feminism, of this, here's why men are evil, men suck, so forth, really coming into its own for a while in the early mid-2010s. And then eventually people really unified around race specifically as the grand injustice that people would fight against. And there were always other things, there are always the whole suite of progressive causes. It's intersectional after all. Oppression is intersectional. But the animating ones became this idea of, well, now that this thing was so clearly right, this gay marriage thing was so clearly right, then this whole framework, we accept all of this framework, and it just gives us a checkbox of here's another oppression to fight, here's another oppression to fight, here's another oppression to fight, here's another oppression to fight. And that's very easy to motivate people around. People like fighting oppression.
What's always struck me as the insidious part of that is the last thing you said, that people love fighting oppression and they find it very motivating. And if there isn't a clear oppression to fight, they'll find one.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the most impactful social science studies for me personally has been one examining prevalence-induced concept change. And this is going to be from memory, so apologies if I get parts of it wrong, but what they found was basically that if they took people and asked them to identify blue dots on a field of blue and purple dots, and then gradually shifted the field towards more purple and less blue, people would never stop finding around the same amount of blue dots as they shifted the field a little more. People kept pulling out and saying, no, these are the bluest dots. These are the bluest dots. These are the bluest dots. That so long as you have any sort of spectrum at all, people are very good at picking up on patterns. And so if you are trying to define and hunt down oppression, then no matter how much exists, if that's the sole frame that you're going in looking for, then you will find it.
What you just said makes me feel a lot better. I'm not sure if I should feel better, actually. I want to run this past you. So,
Didn't make me feel exactly better. It was well put, nicely articulated, but it's not a heartwarming message, Enosh. I'm excited to hear your thought there.
Well, I have quite a lot of personal guilt around this. I think 2.5 years ago, I wrote up a post. I think I titled it "I Repent" or something like that. Like, I literally felt I had to do some sort of penance for being involved in the new atheism movement, because I really felt like I was typical minding the whole world, that we did not need religion, that religion was actively net harmful, and the best thing we could do is clear religion out entirely. And once everyone saw this was like fake and bad, the world would be better. And we didn't necessarily need something to replace religion with. It would just be better by default with religion gone. So that is what I fought for. And that is basically, we were successful. I feel like religion, as you said, is so much less in the public life at all. Like, almost no one uses religion as a justification for any public policy anymore. It's not even mentioned. It's not in people's daily lives the way it used to be. And for a while, I thought that was good, but it seems that this is my take now. Enough people have a deep, fundamental psychological need for something in that sphere that if you just take it away, they find something else to fill it. And instead of something that has gone through a piece of Westphalia and many centuries of taming to make it stuff that we can all have a society around, they found the new virulent thing to take over. And it just felt like I had gone in and cleared out this thriving forest ecosystem, cut it down to nothing, and left all this dry tinder on the ground. And like the spark of wokeism came in and set the entire world on fire. And I was like, oh no, I thought I was doing a good thing, but instead it was like the worst thing. And obviously I'm not a huge part of it. I'm not like, one of the four horsemen or anything, but I was in the trenches, and now I feel like I was fighting the wrong thing and actually happened to make the world worse somehow. And your idea that maybe it was Oberfell and the fact that this coalition had all this momentum and energy and resources behind it, and all of a sudden they didn't have a goal anymore, and so they had to redirect it to somewhere else. It feels less bad than my idea of we stripped religion away from people and they were now immune compromised and were infected by something else that was worse. What is your take on the whole, how new atheism was involved in this, and my idea behind maybe we fucked up?
Look, I was never a big fan of new atheism, and this was because I was religious during that whole phase. And so what I experienced was things like Richard Dawkins coming in and having a farcical debate against the lead singer of The Killers, who was like this Jack Mormon, like half enthusiastic sort of lay Mormon, who suddenly they go on a Swedish TV show together, and Richard Dawkins is trying to press him on the errors in the Book of Mormon. And I always thought that was deeply distasteful. I thought it was just dumb. So my experience with new atheism was very much the same sort of brashness and the same sort of certainty and the same sort of aggressiveness of social justice progressivism. In terms of clearing things out, I don't know that it cleared things out so much as set the rhetorical tone and set the tone of this is what is acceptable if you are correct. And I think that very much social justice progressivism has adopted the rhetorical tone and the certainty of new atheism. So I'm not going to say that I don't think new atheism did clear things out exactly, but I do think it acted as one of the rhetorical foundation stones of the social justice progressive movement.
Okay.
So sorry, no absolution, but
yeah. Damn it, I will continue to whip myself.
During the New Atheism Wars, I think there was a bit of like the, we're oppressed kind of thing, like we, the atheists or whatever. But I don't think it played that card nearly as heavily as it's played in the last decade.
I would agree.
Yeah, but I do think that you're onto something, that it set the rhetorical framing of, hey, aren't the people who disagree with us like total morons, rather than aren't they people who have different beliefs and are, rational or not, are reaching rational conclusions based on those beliefs. Like it kind of moved the, I don't want to keep using your phrasing, but it moved the rhetorical framing from I don't know, polite and earnest disagreement to isn't the other side a bunch of idiots?
Yes.
I can totally see that.
Yeah, and you can point to prior things with that. I think you can point to conservative talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, and people like that as other predecessors to that same rhetorical style. I'm sure you can go further back and keep seeing that same sort of thing. But I think in terms of the specific thing that set the frame for how social justice progressives would interact, New Atheism sort of set up the permission structure of you don't actually have to treat your opposition with any sort of respect because they are immoral morons who have no clue what they're talking about and base all their ideas on irrational nonsense.
Yeah, I do think social justice progressivism it's a little worse, more than a little worse, but maybe that's because now I'm on the receiving end of it. I was at a friend's house recently and she had various pieces of art on one wall that were just comments on basically on social justice progressivism. It was really neat, but one of them contained the line written within it, I could be wrong, but you could be evil, which which just feels like it's a even greater justification for doing anything really that needs to be done in name of SJP, because the other side is literally evil. Like, why would you even need to negotiate with them?
Yeah, and I think so there's that, and I think to be fair to the New Atheists, the very emphatic difference between them and the progressives is that the New Atheists, they were eager to debate. Now, I'm not much of a debate bro. I've never been much one for like sitting down and saying, here's why you're wrong. Let's have a fisticuff battle with it. But I mean, I will sometimes. But the New Atheists, they thrived on that and they wanted to challenge people and they wanted people to come into their spheres and they wanted to just have this knockdown brawl, looking at all the details, dragging up all the hard evidence. Like they lived for that. And the progressives have really veered away from that and are really very cynical about the idea of debate or discussion in many ways, and much more interested in staying more insular and working more within their own group, within the people who align with them, while treating those outside as not just foolish, but unworthy of conversation, unworthy of consideration, and potentially threatening to let too near.
A cynic might observe that the reason that the New Atheists invited debate and the current SJP movement doesn't is that the New Atheists believed they were on firm ground and that they'd win an argument, whereas maybe people on current platforms of SJP talking points don't have that conviction. They might think in their heart of hearts, if I were to have a debate, I could lose because I'm not sure if I'm right. But then they can stand up and say, I'm not going to debate because you guys are bad. And why would I even talk to a bad person?
Right. I think so. That's the frame. That's one frame of it, and one that is nice and flattering for you or me, and one that I have some sympathy to. Another frame that I think they would be a little more internally. This is how they would describe it. Is that atheism? That was a question of what's true versus what's false. Social justice progressivism is a question of what's right versus what's wrong. And so the New Atheists, truth claims were very important to them and the specifics were very important to them. Whereas the social justice progressives, obviously you or I can pick out any number of truth claims that they are careless on, to say the least. But the truth claims aren't what animates them. What animates them is this broader framework that is neither true nor false, but a moral framework that says, there is this sort of oppression that exists, and our duty is to fight this sort of oppression. It's a difference between arguing on the side of falsehood, that's fine, but if you're trying to argue on the side of evil, well, now that's an entirely different thing.
That's really well put.
You've been talking a lot about religion being the source of truth, of motivation. I think in your thread you said, broadly defined, religion is the unified source of a person's moral and epistemic beliefs put into practice, which is also great line, and one that I tend to agree with, especially in practice. But I think there are a lot of people who would say that it's kind of Spinoza-ing. It's not a correct definition of religion. Is that okay? Why or why not is that not Spinoza-ing? And if it is, why are you okay with it?
That's a very good question. That's a really good question, because a lot of people do wish I would use a word like ideology or something like that, and sometimes I humor them and I say pseudo-religion. So obviously what a lot of people think about when they are saying religion is belief in the supernatural in one degree or another. But if you look at the religions that have actually existed, the world religions that have actually existed, I would say the unifying thread that binds them is not precisely the supernatural, although the sublime does come into it, and obviously the supernatural very often does come into it. But the thing that unites Buddhism and Shintoism and, to an extent, Confucianism and Christianity and Islam and the Baha'i and so forth into one box is not that they all believe in the supernatural, but that they all provide this sense of higher purpose and this organization of someone's entire life, is what I would argue. If someone does want to say, look, it is very important to me that the word religion be reserved for the supernatural, I'll say, look, that's fine. Pick a different word, but I hope you can see the concept that I'm gesturing at and the reason I am using a unified word for these things.
Do you think people would be fine with just using the word secular religion? Because I do think it captures everything about religion except for the supernatural part.
Yeah, I used the phrase secular religion myself. I would argue basically that there have been at least two, arguably at least three, successful to one degree of successful, vital secular religions. You had old school Marxism back in the day, which was so powerful that it led a third of the world before collapsing, and that had a clear question of whether it would take over the entire world. I would say that was the first, and a pretty bad proof of concept in many ways, but I would say the first real proof of concept that modern secular religion could and would exist. And then you have social justice progressivism, obviously. And then on the scale of a more minor religion, and some would argue it's a subset of some others, I would say that effective altruism is a third secular religion. But yes, I think the phrase secular religion is appropriate. It's one that I use. I treat it as a subset of religion. If people don't want to treat it as a subset, that's their thing. But yes.
I don't want to rabbit hole on this if it's not interesting, but I'm surprised to hear effective altruism kind of put in the same bucket as the secular religion or social justice progressivism umbrella, because to me they do have an express goal, an express area of goals, whether it be immediate animal welfare or something like Will McCaskill's long-termism. But I guess I could imagine them rankling at being at the comparison.
Yeah, and I don't mean to insult them with the comparison, and if they want to disclaim it, whatever. Obviously, I think a lot of effective altruists. I've got into it with Will McCaskill on Twitter about this at one point when he's trying to argue that effective altruism should be to altruism what science is to scientific thinking, something similar. That it's not actually movement; it's just like this general framework. And some people do think of it that way, and I recognize that. I do think, if you look at the degree of organization that has gone into building this unified set of people pursuing a lot of very specific common ends, if you look at the broader motivating framework, this utilitarianism that's often this distance-blind utilitarianism, and the memeplex that has arisen within it, I think it has a lot of shared characteristics with other movements in a way that makes it useful to evaluate within a similar frame. I think it's much smaller and much healthier than many of those other movements, but I think that there are similarities worth understanding.
For what it's worth, I agree about the EA is more than kind of. It's strongly a new religion, and I'm jealous of them
Yeah, me
in
too.
that regard. Yeah, because they somehow harness this thing that motivates people and inspires people and gives them a vital force in their life. And it's hard to do that. And the fact that they managed to do it is amazing and fantastic. And I kind of wish it would have been aimed at something. I mean, effective altruism is really great. I'm not dissing it, but I feel like they're slightly off.
Right. No, I'll diss it. I'll say that I agree with you. I think that they have a fundamentally inaccurate. So here is what I will say specifically. Any movement that sees Brian Thomasick as a moral paragon, as someone worth considering very seriously on morality, is a movement that discredits itself.
Why is that?
Because negative utilitarianism is... If you listen to a negative utilitarian...
Oh, is he a negative utilitarian?
Yes.
Oh.
He is. He is emphatically a negative utilitarian. And any movement that can hear someone say, basically, the only reason I don't end the entire universe is I can't figure out a way to do it painlessly enough, that is so fundamentally inimical to the human project that it should be able to be rejected on site, sight unseen, said, no, this end that you are pursuing is misaligned. This end that you are pursuing has deeply evil long-run consequences. That, yes, we understand the importance of suffering in a broader picture, but reducing suffering is not the end in itself, cannot be the end in itself, because so much that goes wrong when you treat that as the end in itself. And look, there's a lot that I respect about effective altruism, and what they do, the people within it are very, very seriously committed towards doing good. But I worry deeply about the underlying framework, and in particular, utilitarianism in general, but particularly the influence of negative utilitarianism in it, I think is under-discussed and deeply toxic.
Yeah. I think my main criticism about EA is that while it seems to be net good for the broader world, it seems to be very net negative to its adherents, which sort of makes it terrible. If you are deeply into it, it seems to make your life worse, which is not great for a movement.
I want to be very careful. Like, I don't want to call it terrible, anything like that. In that, like, I love the EAs that I've met, and I really respect their commitment. And I think that a lot of them would say, no, I think that my life is good. I think I am in a good place with this. So I hesitate to, I think that you're not wrong in saying that sometimes, it does significantly make them in a less comfortable position than they could be. And I think they would say this is just a sacrifice worth making. That's not exactly what I'd point to as the core, though, in just saying that I think the issue at the core is not whether it makes them happy or not, so much as whether it's aligned towards the good in full.
Okay.
I'll just as the EA stand here, there's the essential difference that, especially contrasted with like the SJP, I mean, EA, it's about lifting people up and making the world a better place for people with less fortunate opportunity, not about throwing bricks at evil people. Yeah, and I haven't heard of this anti-utilitarian guy that you mentioned, and I'm less online than probably your average podcaster, so maybe he's very popular, but
he's a niche figure, to be clear. But I think that if you look at his ideas and the way they interact with broader ideas like his and his broader framework is taken very seriously and is very broadly, not fully, but broadly compatible with EA in a way that at least deserves notice.
Yeah, one of our first dozen or 24 episodes, way back 7 or 8 years ago, was with a guy that advocated a position like that, if he could end life on the planet painlessly, he would. And I found that abhorrent and disgusting and wondered if he was just kind of being an edgelord or if this was his real position. I feel like people who say that don't really... this gets us too far. This is rabbit holing, but my 1 cent on that is that I feel like people who say that and I don't want to say like they don't believe what they're saying because that'd be mind reading, but it's like, do they not love people?
They don't. I mean, this is the whole antinatalism concept and the whole, like, the idea that any amount of good does not outweigh, like, the experience of suffering and so forth. And they don't love life. They think that life is a curse inflicted on the unwary to an extent. Yeah.
I want to defend them briefly because I was this person in my teens and 20s, and it's a horrible point of view, and it's a death cult, and it shouldn't exist. But it's not that they're evil people; it's that they are horribly depressed and in a lot of pain people. And when you are in that place, you cannot fathom of an existence that isn't net suffering. That all life is pain, basically, and the most merciful thing you can possibly do is prevent life from existing because there's no net positive life to be found in the universe. So it's a thing that you get past once you stop being in deep pain and having deep depression. But it's not a position born out of evil. It's a position that is evil but is born out of pain.
Yeah. This goes into my broader philosophy back to the Bible. There's this line from Paul, we fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, that I think very few people... There's the classic line from Jai, almost nobody is evil, almost everything is broken. And so when I'm talking about negative utilitarians, and when I'm talking about progressives, and I'm talking about all of these movements, I have met really good and really serious and really sincere individuals in virtually every movement you care to name. So I will rail against, in very harsh terms, the memeplexes that animate people, but I rail against those memeplexes because they turn good people towards ends that I see as harmful, and not because I think that the people within them are fundamentally wrong or fundamentally bad or fundamentally any worse than you or I.
Yeah. All right. I got 3 things that I want to hit before we're totally done here, if you got a few more minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
First, this is actually from a tweet from Yassine. He has this take on religions and the separations between religions. I'm just going to read this. There's a sort of peace treaty in place for religious beliefs in the discourse. A don't ask, don't tell, where religious friends agree not to proselytize in exchange for not having their beliefs scrutinized. He goes on to say that there's no similar peace treaty in place for, and he prevaricates a bit, but basically I interpret him as saying there's no peace treaty in place for wokeism, for this SJP thing. He says, I want to be able to say, I see this is part of your religion, precisely to leave people alone with their beliefs, but no treaty is possible because neither side would agree to the terms. No proselytizing and no scrutinizing. I think this is very obviously true. When you have a vital religion, you want to proselytize. That is in your soul. It's what's driving you. So they're not going to agree to that. But I'm wondering, do you think this is one reason why these movements so vehemently reject being called religions? Because then that would bring them under the Westphalian Truce and basically neuter them? Just be like, oh yeah, that's just another belief. We agree not to talk about those and you can have your belief. That would take all the fire out of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that to accept yourself as a religion is, in the current cultural context, to accept yourself as needing to be tamed. And they don't accept themselves as needing to be tamed because they are a vital religion. No vital religion wants to just be a religion, and you've already lost.
Right. I believe the old phrase was every cause wants to be a cult. Every motivating force wants to be a vital religion.
Yeah.
Finally, you end your thread with, not satisfied with it or with the other great religious movements on offer, do what progressives did. Get to work. Do you have suggestions on this getting to work thing? Because ever since we interviewed Lucian Greaves, I've been convinced that rationalism should have a religious arm to it. That obviously not all rationalists are going to want in, but I think some rationalists could opt into it and would. I think it would be good for us to have a sort of a religious arm of rationalism that can work in this way. I don't know if that's a fool's errand, though, due to the vital aspect, or what would you offer here? Or what would you suggest?
It is no small thing to really seriously suggest a new religion. And what I would say is that I think it is something that needs to happen. I think it is something that I personally am in many ways trying to build a framework for and trying to feel out what a healthy framework for it looks like. I don't think it's something that can just be conjured on a whim and can work. I think that the underlying forces are in play. A lot of people are sensing the need for that sort of thing. A lot of energy is around that sort of thing. But in terms of specifics, I hesitate to lean too hard into specifics yet, other than saying that I think that the time is about ripe for that sort of thing to rise up.
What are you seeing? Where would you go?
I think that, in particular, the most interesting political movement for me right now is or political adjacent, is anyone who is in our circles who winds up on Twitter seems to be drawn towards Teapot or in-group or whatever one wants to call it, the poster at Twitter, which I would say is not a unified group and is not meant to be a unified group. I saw it described recently as an oasis where, a bunch of travelers come and occupy space near each other and look at the monsters nearby and look at the curiosities nearby and everything. But it's birthplace of cultures more than exactly a community in and of itself. But I would say that rationalists and people like rationalists who want to do interesting things right now, seems to be the place things are happening.
Are you coming to Vibe Camp 3 or Fluidity Forum?
I'm thinking about Vibe Camp. I'm going to be at Manifest, trying to decide if I can afford another weekend off for Vibe Camp as well.
Son of a bitch. I'm going to Big Stick, which is the same weekend as Manifest, and otherwise I would be at Manifest.
But yeah, we'll see it pending on Vibe Camp. Currently weighing my options with Vibe Camp.
All right. This last thing, how do furries fare in the oppression Olympics? Because like
Hard left pivot.
yeah, in theory they're a sexual minority, so they should do good, but like in practice they seem to be kind of persona non grata in there. Like, I don't know, possibly because you guys are so based and successful and maybe also mostly gay. What is your, as an insider, view of where you are here in the SJP ladder sphere? If you'd like to hear the answer to that, as well as whether Trace agrees that furries are based and successful, what this has to do with trans people, and whether Eneash is a furry? What? Question mark? Subscribe on Patreon or at Substack. Link is in the show notes.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been fun.
It's been great. Is there anything you wanted to leave us with before we go?
I think that's about it, really. Obviously, I do all my work on tracingwoodgrains.com or twitter.com/@tracewoodgrains. Those are the main places to find me. And I, have hopefully a lot of things coming down the pipeline in my usual erratic way. So stay tuned.
Ooh, excellent. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much. This was a really engaging conversation, and for what it's worth, I followed 10 people on Twitter. Now I follow 11. So,
hey, awesome.
I'll keep an eye out for the rest of your stuff. This is great.
All right. Well, thank you guys for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Welcome back.
So it's been, 2 weeks since we recorded this?
At least.
With Trace? Yeah, it's been about 2 weeks because of the vibe clips and everything that happened in between.
Or maybe right after. Who knows?
Who knows?
Anyway, so we're recording this on the 30th, so it's a little less fresh. But I made a note to myself because when we were talking with Trace about one of the reasons he doesn't like EAs, he mentioned some guy. I forget the guy's name, but that EAs take this guy seriously. And I'd never heard of him, but we were just talking about what makes us better than the social justice religion was that we talk with people that we consider the way I took it was we don't put people in good and evil buckets. Mm-hmm. And this guy's ideas, the negative utilitarian, the reason that he doesn't kill all life on Earth painlessly is because he can't, which is
all life in the universe, even.
Oh yeah, well, that seems a little judgmental. I mean, human lives have pain. It seems premature to assume that that's a necessary condition for all life in the universe.
Having been there, it seems very obvious when you're there that life is pain, and there's no other way around that.
If he's just depressed, then I get it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was coming from not to say like a depressed person couldn't come up with a well-reasoned philosophical position, but that's what I was imagining was this was someone's carefully and objectively reasoned position.
It can be both.
It can be, yeah. But if you're coming from a place of pain, then yeah, everything hurts. And
I'm still not convinced that they aren't wrong, just to clarify that. Like, I keep thinking, I'm going to get old, and my life's going to get shittier. If I live through enough old, shitty years that suck, my life could be net negative, despite how awesome it is right now. So, like, part of my thing is, like, I hope I have the balls to pull the plug once I realize things are net negative enough that it's not worth suffering through another 20 years of this crap and making my life net be in the red. Although, now I'm like, should I be saying this out loud?
Well, for me, I don't think it's so easily weighed. Like, I guess maybe because I'm less of, like, an intuitive utilitarian than I used to be. Like, I don't think that I can, when I'm declared dead, I can add all the utils and negative hedons or whatever and say my life was X good, right? I don't think that's how it works. I think life has its ups and downs, and in the end, I think it's worth it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Yeah, it really depends on how you measure things. And one way you can measure things is by their effects, in which case people have a lot more net positive lives. What if all you're measuring things by is how you feel, then you run into trouble.
Yeah. Also, depending on where your happiness set points are and how badly you internalize trauma or whatever, you can make your total utils go down just by psychology and bad coping. So, yeah, I don't know. I do know that there is an incentive to keep people alive because the positive externalities you can get from people being alive are usually much higher than the negative internalities they get from being in pain most of their life, but still being useful for an hour or two a day.
How do you mean? Like the aged grandparent who, is around and makes people happy, but their day-to-day sucks?
That is what I mean, yeah.
Okay.
That they can provide some help throughout the day through childcare or whatever, wisdom, things, everyone can contribute stuff as long as they aren't actively destructive. If they contribute just a tiny bit, but are in a lot of internal pain that they don't tell people about, that is net positive to everyone around them. And if that's how you measure life, that's great, actually. That's a good thing to be in your community. But if how you measure life is like how much pain versus pleasure do I feel in any given day, then maybe those are not years that you should have stuck around for.
See, I'm definitely, I think, more in the former camp then, because I feel like, somebody whose life is pain, but does their best to make the world a better place and largely succeeds.
That's admirable.
Right. It's admirable. And the world's better.
Yeah.
Let's say Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't a fraudster who went to prison and donated $50 billion to charity, but was miserable every day. His life was still amazingly impactful and well worth it, right? Like,
I think
would the world have been better off if he didn't exist? No.
I hate that example because all the negative affect of what he actually did. But what about like
Will McCaskill?
I was going to say Robin Williams.
Right.
Comedian, did the voice of the genie, made everyone around him happy, but ended up killing himself because he was just miserable. Didn't
he get some prion degenerating dementia?
Did he?
I believe so.
Oh, maybe.
I need to fact check that, but I thought it was depression at first too. Then I had heard that he had some degenerative dementia, which is famously super painful to die from. And if that's the case, I would check out too.
Yeah.
Not only am I losing my mind, but it's going to hurt the whole time. Forget that.
Yeah.
My wife works with people that they've lost their mind, but they're super happy because it's 1956 and, they don't know what's going on around them. Right.
Right.
That isn't an existence to me that's worth living, but it's better than being in agony and not knowing why the whole time. Right.
Yeah.
But all I wanted to get at was that, and maybe I misremembered part of the conversation because it was 2 weeks ago. But
right.
Yeah, with Trace, he had said that one of the reasons he wasn't in the EA was because they take people like this guy seriously. For me, I thought that what separated us from the cult and religion of social justice was that we talk with people we disagree with.
Yeah.
And, we may even invite them on our podcasts or whatever, right?
We do it quite a bit, actually.
There was a great episode of The Bailey recently with a reformed halfway reformed white nationalist.
Right.
And it was well worth the listen, and I'm glad that Justine did it.
Yeah. But neither Justine nor Trace considers themselves to be a white nationalist. And I think this was a question of like, do I consider myself to be an EA? Am I aligned with the EAs? Like, you can still talk to them while saying I'm not aligned with them, like they did with the white nationalist.
Sure.
And I think maybe that's what he was getting at, that like a movement that considers someone who has this philosophy a legitimate part of their movement is not one that he can consider himself to be a part of.
And I'll clarify with him before I say that's, I don't want to say ridiculous, but if I had to agree with 100% of every movement that I consider myself allied with, then I wouldn't be involved with anything. Yeah. Right?
Agreed.
Maybe, and actually that might be Trace's position. I think he's not in any buckets, right? So if that's his vibe, that's legit. But yeah, for me, I figure like the thing that makes us that if we're going to say we're better than those SJW zealots, not that like just the zealot ones, not the cool ones. What makes us better is that we'll talk with people we disagree with.
Maybe we should just get Trace back on the mic.
Yeah, we'll have to
with him a little bit.
I'll have to ask about that. That sounds good.
Okay.
Well, thanks for indulging me.
Yeah.
But we also had to talk about this episode's Less Wrong posts.
Yes. Oh, but before we do that, we got to thank the Guild of the Rose people for being awesome and guildy.
Oh, yeah. The Guild of the Rose, they're awesome and guildy. Check them out. They are the organization, guildoftherose.org, that we partner with. They share our mission of raising the sanity waterline, making everyone's life better through the tools of rationality, equipping people with techniques and, I don't want to say tools again, to embetter your life in every regard.
And to help you hone those rationalist skills while you're doing it.
Exactly.
And do the exact opposite of trying to wipe out all life from the universe.
That's right.
Which is why we can get behind their organization.
Yeah. If they were trying to kill everybody, I wouldn't be a fan.
Yeah.
Check them out. I love their skill tree system. You can just go to guildoftherose.org. And if you're like me and don't want to join a cohort because you're a committophobe, you can still sign up and do all the things that you can do solo by yourself. And it's really cool.
One of the courses they offer is a disaster preparedness course, which I mentioned because that is going to be our next IRL Field of the Rose course here in Denver.
Oh, that's awesome. So do check them out. Also check out this week's Less Wrong posts.
Yes.
Start with the Savannah Poets.
This one starts off with sort of an improvised poem from Richard Feynman's writings. Do you want to read it since you were our poem reader?
I'm the poem reader?
You were the last time.
I think I did my turn poems. Then. You go for it.
Oh God, I don't want to read poetry. I'm bad at it. All right. Poets say science takes away from the beauty of the stars, mere globs of gas atoms. Nothing is mere. I too can see the stars on a desert night and feel them. But do I see less or more?
For far more marvelous is the truth than any artist of the past imagined. Why do the poets of the present not speak of it? What men are poets who can speak of Jupiter if he were like a man, but if he is an immense spinning sphere of methane and ammonia, must be silent? Feynman was so fucking cool.
Yeah, it's taken from Feynman Lectures on Physics, Volume 1, pages 3 through 6. The post starts off with that, and then Eliezer says that last question there, like, who are these poets that can speak of Jupiter like a man, but not like a gas ball? What's up with them? He says, I think that's an actual legit question that you can answer. And the answer is that if Jupiter is like us, he can fall in love and lose love and regain love. He can laugh and weep. If Jupiter is an immense spinning sphere of methane and ammonia, it is more difficult for the poet to make us feel. Which kind of sounds like he's saying this is a skill issue, poets.
Agreed. Yeah. I like that phrasing. It is more difficult. You can't say, and Jupiter shared your struggles or whatever, but man, you can talk beautifully about stuff in science. I refer again to Richard Dawkins, not just in Weaving Rainbow, but in The Greatest Show on Earth, his book on here's evolution in 300 and change pages. You can just feel the love and magic and majesty and poetry coming through it.
That's awesome.
And since I'm not a poet, I can't put this in a poetic way without putting in more effort. But there's an amazing beauty to the fact that I share literal cousinship with the fruits I had for breakfast.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
I can describe the fruits as their color or whatever, and that's something. But to think that we're actually related, not just everything on earth is connected, man. But no, if we go back far enough, we shared a parent. That is to me just one of the most remarkable facts that humanity has in our bucket of facts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there are people that can actually do this.
Yeah.
In the post, Eliezer says, the biblical story of the rainbow is a tale of bloodthirsty murder and smiling insanity. How could anything about raindrops and refraction properly replace that? Raindrops don't scream when they die. So science takes the romance away, says the romantic poet, and what you are given back never matches the drama of the original, even if you do know the equations, because the equations are not about strong emotions.
Yeah, and if the equations aren't about strong emotions, it doesn't mean they can't evoke them.
Yeah.
Right? If I had more of an intuitive feeling of physics than I do of biology, I'm sure there's things in physics that would that could move me in the same way. There's almost a physics pun in there somewhere.
They could apply enough force to you.
Exactly.
Okay. This part I thought was really inspiring and harkens back immediately to Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, in my mind. He says, it's not necessary for Jupiter to be like a human because humans are like humans. If Jupiter is an immense spinning sphere of methane and ammonia, that doesn't mean that love and hate are emptied from the universe. There are still loving and hating minds in the universe. Us.
Yeah.
Damn good point.
I guess the reason one would hold up Jupiter as an example is for the same reason one would hold up any fictional character, because that way, you can attribute whatever you want to them and they can have whatever story you want. Mm-hmm. But just make it a fictional human or a fictional whatever. But the fact, that shiny spot in the sky is a ball of gas and not somehow also a human-shaped person with, thoughts and feelings, that doesn't make our thoughts and feelings any less interesting. If anything, it makes them more compelling because they're just here.
Yeah.
Right?
I think, I don't know, it's a different world aesthetic if everything is has some sort of intentionality, emotional drive to it. Is it Shintoism that believes every object has some sort of animating spirit?
Yeah, it might be in Shintoism. And yeah, there's something to that.
It definitely feels like a different world if everything has some kind of spark of magic in it, right? So I can kind of see being sad to learn that that's not the case, but
it's a different kind of magic, though,
yeah.
right? Jupiter being the thing that it is. Actually, the next sentence in here is perfect. With more than 6 billion of us at the last count, this was published ages ago. With more than 8 billion of us at the last count, does Jupiter really need to be on the list of potential protagonists?
Yeah.
I think that we've got lots of examples and all of our fictional examples. We don't necessarily need to say, well, also that shiny spot in the sky. But I understand there's a kind of a cool thing of like, oh yeah, there's this innate energy to everything that gives it, everything wants, like water doesn't move downhill because of gravity, it moves because it wants to.
Right, yeah.
Like, I get that, but we talked about rainbows last time, and, rainbows are there not because they want to be there, but it doesn't make them any less cool. Maybe it makes them less cool in that one specific regard. If you believe that they were there because the sky was happy or something, and it's like, oh, the sky's not really happy, but it sure looks happy, I
think there's also something to having gods or mythical figures that are like archetypes that are just the complete personification and encapsulation of a particular emotion or a particular mood that it's different from talking about a real human.
Yeah, but you do that with protagonists of story. Achilles, the embodiment of anger and I guess action, maybe. All the
of being a whiny bitch.
Right, that too. I mean, there's all your mind is the limit as far as inventing those characters. I prefer to live in this universe rather than a universe where there are actually capricious gods with all of their whims and powers and seemingly random bouts of mass destruction, right?
Yeah.
So
it would be more fun if we had AIs that we trained to be archetypes, although also very dangerous. So,
well, give it 6 months.
Okay. Going to your point here, Elias also says, if you write of Jupiter as though it were a human, then you are making our map of the universe just a little more impoverished of complexity. You are forcing Jupiter into the mold of all the stories that have already been told on Earth.
Yeah.
And he ends with this, which is just massive call out. He says, Richard Feynman asked, what men are poets who can speak of Jupiter if he were like a man, but if he is an immense spinning sphere of methane and ammonia must be silent? Eliezer answers, they are savanna poets who can only tell stories that would have made sense around a campfire 10,000 years ago. Savanna poets who can tell only the great stories in their classic forms and nothing more.
Take that, peasants.
Yeah. Level up your fucking poetry game.
It's interesting. It wasn't until you primed me to look at this as like throwing shade that I took it that way. I took it merely as like descriptive, I think, on previous readings. Yeah. But it is kind of a diss. And it's like, yeah, people with small imaginations can do that. And those, or have to do that rather, right?
Yeah. Although they would argue with us about that.
The Savannah poets, you think?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure Keats was probably a genius. So he has a different aesthetic, and he would argue that it's not an impoverishment of his mind. Maybe he has just a different utility function than we do, to borrow the rationalist phrase.
Could be.
But I really see Eliezer's point. Like Keats, if you wanted to, you could put your mind to this. You're a freaking genius. You could find the way to invoke all the emotions without depending on mysticism and ignorance and things that literally don't exist.
I agree. I like that a lot. And it leads really well into the next post, which is kind of like a short summary of this one.
Yeah.
But it hits on one of the notes that Feynman touched on. Make sure he drives this home. And this is the thing. This is the one I didn't have to reread, but I did anyway because it's fun. Yeah. But this is the one I remember from the first time reading it.
Me too. This is one of the ones that just sticks in your mind forever.
Joy in the merely real.
Mm-hmm.
And it again starts with John Keats's Lamia about the catalog of dull things and science, yada yada, and then Feynman just nothing is mere. Well, because it says, "Do not all charms fly at the touch of, or at the mere touch of cold philosophy," and nothing is mere. And I always add that in my head that nothing is just. If someone's using the word, "Oh, just do this," just is usually doing a lot of work.
Yeah.
Because if you say "do this," people don't do that. People don't say "do this" when there's like this hard, complicated, unknown step in the middle. They say just do that when they're in my experience.
Over.
Yeah. If I looked out, for next usages of people doing that, I'm probably find some counterexamples. But in my quick assessment, I think Dan Dennett had one that was like, if someone says certainly, then it's like, no, it's not.
Okay.
Certainly it's true. Then he's like, no, that's a red flag. It's not then. If they have to say certainly.
Yeah. I have if someone ever says trust me, that is a red flag that I should probably not trust them right then.
Right. Yudkowsky opens this one wonderfully. You've got to admire that phrase, dull catalog of common things. What is it exactly that goes in this catalog, besides rainbows, that is?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Things that are mundane, normal things, unmagical things, things that are known or knowable, things that play by rules or play by any rules, which makes them boring, things that are part of the ordinary universe, things that are, in a word, real.
Uh-oh. Yeah, because now that's what I call setting yourself up for a fall. At that rate, sooner or later, you're going to be disappointed in everything. Either it will turn out not to exist, or, even worse, it will turn out to be real.
Yeah, if you can't find joy in the merely real, you're doomed.
Yeah. Just continuing on, he says, nothing is inherently mysterious, so to worship a phenomenon because it seems so wonderfully mysterious is to worship your own ignorance.
Yeah, this is, links back to mysterious answers to mysterious questions. That's one of my favorite takeaways from my first time reading this, in my early 20s, was just like, and this came hot on the heels of, again, that harkens back to the new atheist arguments that were going on at the time, but the God of the gaps kind of style of argument that, well, sure, you've explained this, but now what about this? Mm-hmm. Or the other gaps would also be like fossil record. Well, sure, you found the missing link, but now you've made two more on either side of it. The God of the gaps in our knowledge was their thing, right? Mm-hmm. And worshiping that gap rather than looking at it seems like it's a different preference that some people have, and not one that I share.
And it's dangerous. People are going to keep filling in those gaps,
however they want to.
Yeah. I like how this ends because it is what is the word for a praising of?
Celebrating.
Okay, celebrating. Yeah, it is a celebration of my heroes, the type of people I admire. He says earlier, if we cannot take joy in things that are merely real, our lives will always be empty. And then ends with, this puts quite a different complexion on the bizarre habit indulged by those strange folk called scientists, wherein they suddenly become fascinated by pocket lint, or bird droppings, or rainbows, or some other ordinary thing which world-weary and sophisticated folk would never give a second glance. You might say that scientists, at least some scientists, are those folk who are, in principle, capable of enjoying life in the real universe.
Well put.
Yeah.
No notes. Yeah, I like that one a lot.
I remember I find less things interesting now than I used to. And the Fascination Lottery that Scott Alexander has written about is a great way to think of this sort of thing. I like the people who are fascinated by the real world and who just want to dig more into it. And especially because, as Eliezer says, since the real world is all that exists, these people are going to have the happiest and most fulfilling lives in the end, because they can enjoy real life. But yeah, I do see a lot of that, like people who consider themselves sophisticated are like, I'm above being interested in bugs and shit.
Yeah, I've noticed this too, and I turned that off as soon as I noticed it in myself to the best that I can. It's a continuous, if I could use a language from Worth the Candle, it's a continuous tweaking of my soul to curb the thing. If anyone's hyped on something, and it seems like there's something about that seems like, oh, that's low brow, that's low class to be like super into whatever. Mm-hmm. And it's like, real sophisticants aren't into stuff. We just take things in, or we appreciate things, but to be like, hyped on something, that's mundane or whatever. Mm-hmm. I try to shut that shit down in my head if it ever tries to rear its head, because enjoying things is awesome. Yeah. And I never want to harsh someone else's buzz or have them harsh mine. Right. I watched the movie Anyone But You with Sydney Sweeney and some other handsome guy. It's a rom-com. The thing in rom-coms that I find them so typically unenjoyable. So like I find the things in them that I can enjoy, but they have the same recipe. Mm-hmm. The couple meets, they have some super easy to resolve misunderstanding that they don't talk about, and that leads to this huge problem. And then that's the whole thing. And then at the end of Act 2, it looks like things are going well. Then there's another misunderstanding, and then at the end, it's like either they get together or maybe they will, and that's how that's the whole thing. Yeah. And I realized that reducing it to that recipe, someone could do the same thing for my favorite treasured genre of movies, and they'd be exactly as right as I am about categorizing rom-coms. So like, I'm not going to shit on someone who likes these things. It's just not typically my cup of tea, but I'll find things in them that I can enjoy. Like I try to with everything.
It's kind of silly, but like sex is the same way if you think about it. It doesn't vary that radically, and yet it's enjoyable every single time you do it.
I mean,
okay, not every single time you do it.
Well, there's that, but also like there's a difference between like I mean, yes, if you zoom out far enough, I guess I'm considering like different just genres of things to enjoy. I don't know anyone who would be like, I don't know, physical pleasures. I guess if someone was like a super hedonist, would that fall into the same bucket as somebody who's really into Marvel movies?
Is there a difference between these two pictures?
I guess one's masturbating while watching them, one's not, right? So, but yeah, no, I see what you're saying. And another Worth the Candle reference. You mentioned about finding, fascination with fewer things. And I'm listening to the first time, but rereading through listening the audiobook. And when he's first trying to connect with the six-eyed doe, he sits there and like talks out loud and about the fact that he used to be like fascinated by things like trees and grass. And he tries to trigger that feeling. And he used to be able to a little easier when he was younger, before he was depressed. And then he triggers it for a minute. We can do that all the time. It takes work.
Yeah, that's the thing I was going to say, that I find this happens much less to me now than when I was younger. I feel like scientists are the ones who have the eternally young brains, where they're always curious like that. And I am still, like, now I've gone on to be much more curious about humans and their relationships and their inner lives. And this has been a wonderful experience, but also I kind of feel like that's the most normie thing to be interested in the world.
If you're coming at it with your unique lens, though, you can still. Plus, even if it is, who cares? Not everyone is as interested in other people as you are, maybe, and that is something to make note of. But also, even if it was like the world's most common interest, doesn't make it less interesting.
Yes. Now I see sometimes people who are like really into Beatles or whatever, and I'm like, how is that possible? And yet I still kind of remember back in the past when I found a special sub-fascination like that and was just all about that for a few months.
Yeah, I try to pour kerosene on those sparks whenever I find them. But yeah, finding like that fascination with the mundane things that I see every day, it does take a specific mindset.
Is it literally just brain chemistry? You think if we get into the post-human future, we can alter ourselves to find that sort of childish wonder, pleasure in all sorts of things? Because I think it's just a better way to exist, to be totally honest.
I mean, you can, speaking of brain chemistry, you can induce this with some small amounts of some chemical compounds.
And I sometimes do.
And you'll find suddenly clouds are way more interesting than they've ever been in your entire life, right? Mm-hmm. Even if you can't really focus on what makes them interesting, they're still fascinating, right? Maybe there's a middle there where you can trigger the interesting part, but the like ability to stay coherent part stays intact. I think that's doable. Mm-hmm. And I think that's doable through not just future sci-fi medicine, but I think through some forms of meditation and metta, the loving kindness meditation, where you focus on the feeling of love that you have for something or somebody, and then just hold on to that feeling. Oh. And then you can orient that towards other things, whether it be other people, humanity at large. I was listening to somebody on some podcast years ago talk about it, and she said the thing that she found most difficult was pointing at herself. Mm. That was the like she could love Hitler before she could love herself.
Wow,
with that feeling. Because I've practiced this a little bit, and it is kind of like holding water in your hands, and then once it slips, you're like, oh, let me go back to my focal point of okay, that's the feeling of love again now, and let me hold on to that again and carry it around.
I'm definitely not the biggest fan of myself, but I would have a harder time loving Hitler, I gotta say.
I can't remember if she said Hitler or not, but she did say she was last. Maybe it's because she knows herself the best, and she knows all of her flaws or something, where, you can paint a picture of what makes, let's not use Hitler, some asshole, what makes them lovable. But for yourself, you're like, I have all these problems. But it's like, they do too. You just don't see them. Anyway, I think that you can kind of foster and nurture that sense. It disappointingly takes effort. I do wonder, we keep saying scientists. Every scientist that not every scientist, the ones that I work with that I've seen on a semi-regular basis are bored as shit. They're not all Neil deGrasse Tyson and Carl Sagan and Richard Feynman, right?
You did say some scientists.
Yeah. I think the science communicators, the ones that like love science, but the other ones, they're there because they love it. Mm-hmm. Like I've been doing twin studies for over 30 years. And as far back as I can remember, it's the same person coordinating them.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know if she's been doing them all 30 years, but at least for the last 20. Mm. She never seems that interested, but she must like it because she's still doing it. Whether or not her joy is present in every moment of the super, super boring tests that she gets to proctor, that's not really the point. I think that she's enjoying the project that she's contributing to, right? Mm. Anyway, Great stuff. And you mentioned Scott Alexander's The Lottery of Fascinations. I don't know if I've read this one, so I'm going to read it, and we'll put it in the show notes.
Oh, it's really good. Well, for next week.
Speaking of looking for things to be happy about, Joy in Discovery
is our first one.
Yep.
And the second one will be Bind Yourself to Reality.
All right.
Sounds kinky.
I'm sure that's what he's going for.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we have one last order of business to cover on this episode, and that is to give a major shout out to Thomas Askew.
Ooh, cool last name.
You're the one who brought this episode to life this fortnight. We appreciate it.
Thomas, thank you.
We got to talk with Tracing Woodgrains. I hope you enjoyed it too, and it was a cool opportunity for us and hopefully for everybody else. I mean, I love doing this, and I love that we get enough support to make it possible to keep doing it. So thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. The hosting isn't free, and every little bit helps.
It does.
Thanks, guys. And thank you, Thomas.
Exactly.
All right. Well, we will see you all in 2 weeks.
Sounds great. See you then.
Bye.